Good morning, and welcome to the SonicWall 2023 Cyber Threat Report, where I'll be discussing and covering all the different changes in the threat landscape in the last 6 months. I'll be talking about some countermeasures that you can take to protect yourselves as an individual and an organisation, and hopefully you will find this useful and mindful information. Today I'll be your host. My name is Alexis Holmes, and I am a Senior Solutions Engineer for SonicWall UK and Ireland. What we're seeing now in the environment is really a big push to more sophisticated methods of attack. No longer being able to utilise the more basic methods that we've seen in the past, threat actors are pushing the edge in order to be able to gain access into core networks. In order to understand this, we utilise the SonicWall Threat Report that we generate, and this will allow you to track these new forms of attack, understand where they're trending, and how to best protect yourself. Despite seeing a year-on-year decline, we're still at the second highest year on record for recorded ransomware. This means that ransomware is still a huge danger for organisations and individuals seeking any way into the perimeter networks to wreak havoc and get financial gain for the threat actors involved. And I think a really good place to begin with this is with our President and CEO, Bob Van Kirk's quote, and I'm going to start at the second sentence here. While organisations face an increasing number of real-world obstacles with macroeconomic pressures and continued geopolitical strife, threat actors are shifting attack strategies at an alarming rate. Now, this is really important to understand because we've seen threat actors become more and more dynamic to shift with the trends and changes not only in the geopolitical environment but also to the security environment. And so, because of that, what we're going to do now is move into the threat report itself in a bit more detail. What we see here is a very high-level snapshot of the cyber attacks that SonicWall has seen in the last year. There are a few things that we can take away from this. Firstly, IoT or Internet of Things is a very noteworthy thing to look at. We can see a massive growth of 87%, and that's really quite large. Another large growth area as well that's worth paying attention to is, of course, cryptojacking, and this has grown by 43% as well. And on the good side, we've seen a big drop in ransomware of 21%, but it's not all good news, as we'll find out why as we progress through this presentation. Here are some key findings from the previous year of 2022. What we see here is, after a long time, and in fact for the very first time since 2018, we see a huge shift in strategy for malware, seeing it grow significantly. Now, this is due to moving environments and how things have moved within the threat landscape, and threat actors have moved accordingly. Cryptojacking also has seen a huge resurgence this year as well, due to new methods of attack and new ways to gain currency. As well as this, phishers are changing their topics to fit their new environments, obviously moving out of COVID and into the environment that we're in now with the geopolitical changes. They've had to adapt their phishing. While modest, 2% year-on-year increase represents the reversal of a long-standing trend. 2022 is the first year since 2018 to see a rise in malware. This was largely fueled by a 43% rise in cryptojacking and an 87% spike in IoT malware, which together offset a 21% drop in global ransomware volume. So as we can see, while global ransomware has indeed decreased, the makeup within malware as a family has grown elsewhere. And so we can see this trending off, with one dropping off and another area growing. And after 3 years, it's still interesting to see this growth still occur. And it still shows that malware as a family is very important and not to be taken lightly. We have now arrived at the top countries for malware for 2022. As in most years, 2022's country-level data has showed a huge variety in its outcomes, each of which contributes to the overall shifts we're seeing at both the regional and the global level. As we see attackers shift tactics, we're also seeing a shift in targets. Malware volume has dropped in countries that traditionally see far more malware, such as the US, a drop of 9%, the UK, a drop of 13%, and Germany with a drop of 28%. On the other side of the coin, the biggest jumps in malware volume have been in the Asia-Pacific region, overall 38% growth, and Latin America with 17% growth, the two regions that typically see the least malware overall. Now, what we can take from this, with malware shifting and changing to different areas, threat actors are looking for the easiest, softest targets they can, and they've shifted their priorities, and this really is a big problem. And because of this, we see that information sharing is paramount. It's so important now to evolve solutions in order to protect and cope with the shifting threat landscape. Communication will be key between not just different vendors, but also specialists as well as end users, bringing together all of this information to work as one to protect against the threat actors. Of course, they will not be sitting idle. They will also be looking to do the same on their side to find new and exclusive ways into core networks in order to generate revenue. Here we have some good news. For the United Kingdom, malware has a year-on-year change down by 13%. And this includes all malware families, such as cryptojacking and ransomware. This really is fantastic news to have it actually drop. Overall, it was quite low at the beginning of the year, and it had a gentle trend upwards, levelling off at July through to September. It was a slight increase in October, but a massive spike in November. Had it not been for that, it may have been an even greater drop than 13%. But nonetheless, we see December, and we've seen it starting to trend back down again. So this really is fantastic news overall for the UK. And so, overall, a healthy year-over-year decrease. Regardless of the attack vector, be it malware or phishing, it nearly always resolves in a ransomware attack. Ransomware volumes dipped to 493.3 million in 2022, a 21% year-over-year decrease. This is fantastic news to see ransomware going down. This really is great news. Now, this can be attributed to multiple different factors. Certainly one of the things we've seen is government agencies taking action against larger ransomware groups and then splitting them up or taking them down. We've also seen different ransomware gangs themselves and ransomware as a service organisers actually split into different organisations rather than being singular large organisations. Other places that have affected this as well are going to be things such as sanctions and policy put in place by governments and agencies. These all play a part with individuals and further organisations for everybody being more security minded. And obviously with security on everybody's mind, the hatches have been battened and security is tighter than ever. Despite 2022's global decrease, not every region saw a drop. Ransomware in Europe jumped 83%, including a 112% increase in the UK. The education and finance verticals were also heavily targeted, with an increase of 275% and 41% respectively. However, less ransomware does not equal low ransomware. If we look, 2022's total volume still easily eclipses that of 2018, 2019 and 2020's totals, and amounts to more ransomware attempts than 2019 and 2020 combined. In order to protect yourself against ransomware, obviously there are some things that are a catch-all that need to be done. You need to make sure that your perimeter has been fully secured. Obviously, if you can stop ransomware coming in, you can mitigate it to a large degree. But invariably, some way or other, it will make its way onto an endpoint. So again, it's very important to make sure that you have endpoint protection as well as gateway protection. Of course, with all the will in the world and all the best protection, sometimes something will get infected regardless. And so because of this, you need to make sure that you've backed up your data. And it's not just good enough to make backups, but you need to make sure that you have good, known, uninfected backups. Otherwise, you will be restoring backups which contain ransomware, and you'll be back to square one again. Despite an overall global drop in ransomware in 2022, we can see some interesting statistics looking at this graph. We can see back in 2020 there was a steady growth that really peaked in Q2 of 2021 and stayed almost level for Q3 with only a slight drop. Now looking at 2022, we see ransomware gradually dropping over the course of the year until we hit Q4, where we see a massive spike up to a huge 154.9 million pieces of ransomware. This is the highest that we've seen since Q3 in 2021. Now, obviously, with this ever-evolving landscape, you need to be aware of evolving tactics. I've mentioned before that you need to put security in place to protect against ransomware, and absolutely that is core. But you have to keep abreast of the situation and understand what's going on. You need to be aware of the evolving attacks and tactics that threat actors are using. In order to do this, try and keep up to date on current threats and trends within the security environment. As well as this, try and adapt your security posture to follow this as well, in order to protect against these new tactics. Relying on signature-based AV is simply not good enough in this day and age. You'll need to bolster this with something that can also detect zero-day threats in order to mitigate that attack surface. And this is really core to tightening down your network and keeping it safe. And again, if other newer technologies evolve to protect against ransomware and its potential threats, it's really worth considering them and bringing them on board. Security moves at a huge speed and it sits still for nobody. So make sure that you're protected. As part of the 2023 threat report, we took a SonicWall threat mindset survey. And what's really interesting with this is over 2022, top of mind for all those that were surveyed was ransomware, above phishing and spear phishing, above encrypted malware and even fileless attacks. Head and shoulders above them all, ransom sat there. And from this we can tell that it is top of concern for all of us. not just for the individual, but for organisations as well. And I think this is really problematic because it can be very costly if it gets into the core network, and it can cause a lot of disruption. Absolutely, it's fully understandable why it's there. Now, ransomware isn't going to go away. If we take into account and examine threat actors, they largely fall into two different categories. We have the financially motivated threat actors that are essentially in it to make as much money as they can. And another area that we see threat actors in, the other type, is going to be information motivated. And here we're going to be looking at sort of nation state, or we're going to be looking at espionage within organisations to steal patents and other such technologies. But nonetheless, ransomware will be used by both types of threat actors. Now, if we look at, in this case, phishing and spear phishing, this can also be used as an attack vector for ransomware. And in fact, if we look at the majority of different ways that you could breach a perimeter, nearly all attack vectors lead to ransomware. And why is this? Why do people use exploits just to lead to ransomware? Simply because disruption may be one thing, but financial reward is its own gain. And so because of this, we need to be vigilant. We need to be able to reduce all aspects of our attack surface. Now, it's one thing to look at it from a networking standpoint and say, oh yes, of course, we've got a firewall, we've got endpoint antivirus, we've got secure remote access, maybe we've moved into using SASE instead for remote connectivity. We've secured the cloud with an API-based solution, so that's all safe too. And that's great. But the trouble is, it's not always your organization's problem. Sometimes it will be other organizations that you pair with. If we look at that, a classic example of this is going to be supply chain attacks. So a supply chain attack is essentially if somebody cannot breach your network because it's tied down very tight, they will find another way in through a supply chain that you utilize that may not be as watertight as yours. And obviously if they can compromise another organization, maybe it's a small organization that's managing your air conditioning units, or somebody that's providing you with office supplies that you have connectivity with, or maybe it's an auditing company that you use. If they can be penetrated, and then they can then be utilized as an access point into your organization. So don't just think of reducing your attack surface as simply as just putting hardware and software into your security policy, but think about it more holistically, about different places, organizations, and individuals that you partner with that may not be as secure as you may first believe. So make sure that you tighten down all access policies as well for third-party organizations and individuals into your company. Doing so will reduce your attack surface and mitigate the threat and potential chance of ransomware getting into your core network and wreaking havoc. Here we see some interesting statistics. What we see here is if we look at the top 3 attack countries by volume for ransomware, we find United States in first place, followed by the United Kingdom and Spain. And what we see here is quite interesting. First of all, if we look at ransomware as a subset of malware, malware in the United States has dropped by 9%. So all those attacks have to go somewhere else. And obviously we've seen a huge growth of malware across Europe. So because of that, attacks are going to be up in the likes of Spain and the United Kingdom. As well as this huge influx of attacks, this can also be due to a multitude of other reasons, such as aging security infrastructure in public utilities that could easily allow ransomware in and obviously increase the overall amount of attacks. A good example of this might be a hospital that's utilizing an out-of-date MRI machine. It functions perfectly well, but the PC that drives it runs Windows XP. The fact that Windows XP is no longer supported and no longer getting security patching from Microsoft makes this a prime example of an easy target. Now, something like an MRI machine would be easy to replace but very costly. And so because of this, it's unlikely to be replaced because it works just fine. We now have a very large target that's easily penetrable. As a nation, being able to protect yourself against all of these different types of attacks is very important. But obviously you would need to have relevant information. You would need to have curated threat intelligence. If you're just looking at the global picture, it may not necessarily be relevant to the region that you're in. So understanding how attacks are targeted against your particular region gives you a way to understand what you need to protect against, and obviously gives you an idea where you should be protecting more. So because of this, it's important to have a threat intelligence feed that is relevant to your region. If we look at the SonicWall Threat Report, this is a global threat report. However, we do break down the statistics regionally to make it relevant for whichever country that you're residing. And this allows both organisations and individuals to better prepare themselves against the influx of attacks. In 2022, SonicWall's patented real-time deep memory inspection, or RTDMI, detected 465,501 never-before-seen malware variants. And we're seeing this as a huge number, and in fact if we take this on a daily number, that's 1,279 pieces of zero-day malware detected every day. And that's huge. That's after everything that's been detected. That's a huge amount of basically zero-day threats. Now, in March alone, RTDMI detected 59,259 new variants. This is more than any other month ever. Combined with the higher than average discoveries in January and February, this helped push Q1 to a total of 147,851 never-before-seen malware variants, the highest of any quarter on record. With the explosion of zero-day threats, you need to ask yourself, how are you protecting against the assault of these unknown threats? As we see, evolving threats are continuing to grow, and as such, it's important to leverage technologies that can allow you to keep pace with this evolutionary arms race. Signatures just simply aren't enough. Even using hashes or protecting your perimeter with intrusion prevention and intrusion detection services, it's just not enough anymore. It's all well and good to lean on the crutch of existing technologies, but it's not going to protect you against what you don't know about. You could encounter a piece of malware that's literally been on the internet for seconds. Having a technology like RTDMI really is core, and this is really important because it just goes to show how many never-before-seen variants are being detected. The Apache Log4j vulnerability, or as it's also known, the Log4 shell vulnerability, has a staggering volume of attacks, around 1.1 billion exploit attempts, averaging about 3.1 million attacks each day. Since December 2021, SonicWall Capture Labs threat researchers have been tracking attempted exploits of this vulnerability, and so far, attack volumes show no signs of slowing. While some had hoped for an initial frenzy of attacks followed by a gradual decrease, our researchers have observed quite the opposite. 61.9 million attempts were observed in December of 2021, the month the attacks were announced, and every month in 2022 exceeded that total by at least 10 million. Worse, these attempts seemed to pick up steam as 2022 went on. The second half of the year had 15% more intrusion attempts than the first half. There are essentially two core attack surfaces that you're looking to protect against. The two attack surfaces that you will need to protect are your perimeter and your internal network. What you'll need to do here is make sure that you have full asset inventories for both hardware and software for both, and make sure that you patch up to date for both in order to mitigate your attack service. Patch management is hard and time consuming, but you will reap great rewards if you do so. When dealing with IPS attempts, one thing that's important to do is to understand the threat actor methodology, what they're doing and why they're doing it. This is very important. Most malware is considered to be a threat commodity, high volumes, easily accessible, and so because of this, what we see is threat actors essentially use a throw it at a wall approach and see what sticks mentality. Essentially, high volume attacks hoping that something will get through the cracks. They just need one victim to click on a link within an organization, and as a result of this spray and pray methodology, we are seeing a large growth in intrusion attempts. Again, another thing that has accelerated this is automation. Now, while we use it with AI and machine learning to help protect everybody, threat actors also use automation to increase the attack rate and get more attacks out there. And so because of this, we've seen this huge increase in intrusion attempts, and I think the fact that people have been battening down the hatches more has also led to more rebuttal. So because of that, we've seen threat actors pushing harder to try and get into networks and find any available space in. This becomes very apparent when we actually look at the intrusion attempts of last year, with a 19% year-over-year increase of attacks, really taking on board this methodology, showing that it's even more important to have your defences up. While very little in the cybersecurity world has returned to its 2019 state, malicious intrusion types are one exception. Just like we saw 4 years ago, remote code executions, or RCEs as they're known, are once again the most common form of malicious intrusion we've observed. But what exactly is an RCE? Well, an RCE attack takes place when a threat actor uses a vulnerability to remotely run malicious programming code, usually an unexpected path with system-level privileges. These vulnerabilities are among the most dangerous on software systems and are frequently used to spread ransomware. A good way to defend against RCEs is to make use of a vulnerability management program in order to perform scanning and patching. The patching itself will be time-consuming and difficult to organise. Network segmentation, however, has also been an important way to stop the potential east-west propagation of malware. So, not having a flat network, putting your devices into separate subnets is very important, and being able to lock down that flow of traffic will really stop the spread of an RCE. Patch management, on the other hand, will basically allow you to remove any potential vulnerabilities in software that you're using. Cryptojacking has risen as a stable, low-profile revenue stream for threat actors, alongside its brash and loud cousin, ransomware. Despite its name, cryptojacking is not the act of stealing your cryptocurrency, but is instead something far more insidious. The cryptojacking software will hide on your workstation or server and will surreptitiously use this device to mine for cryptocurrency, essentially stealing your compute power. This means that your hardware and electricity are being used to generate cryptocurrency for the threat actor over time. If you are using an elastic infrastructure in the cloud, and this occurs, you could suddenly be hit with a bill for tens of thousands of pounds. It turns out that the cryptojacking malware had your CPU constantly pegged at 100% to mine cryptocurrency. This is why you've been hit with such a massive bill. This trend will continue to rise in the future, augmenting threat actor attacks sitting alongside ransomware. In Europe, attack volume surged a staggering 549% year over year. With cryptojacking on the rise, this goes to show that ransomware isn't the only malware people should have at front of mind. When IoT malware attack volume rose just 6% in 2021, after jumping 218% in 2019 and a further 66% in 2020, it offered hope that wild acceleration might be giving way to slower, more stable growth. In 2022, SonicWall Capture Labs threat researchers recorded 112.3 million instances of IoT malware, an 87% increase over 2021. Much of the spike was centered in North America, where attacks rose a staggering 145%, and the US, which saw volumes in excess of 169%. I've previously spoken about IoT in Mindhunter, and it's definitely worth a view if you want to get really deep into the weeds. Essentially, any network-connected device, such as a camera, doorbell, or refrigerator, to name but a few types of device, counts as an IoT device. A good security posture is to put these IoT devices on a separate, tightly controlled network. Segmentation is key. These devices are easily breached because they are rarely patched, shipped with old versions of software that have vulnerabilities, and become a very easy beachhead into the network. As an organization, it's important to put policy in place to control what devices can be introduced into your network and how they are deployed, controlled, and monitored. This is key because you need to stay up to date on firmware updates, and also you need to restrict access of these devices to your core network where possible. Even to this day, email is still the #1 attack vector for threat actors, as an easy way to get malware into a corporate or individual's network. The makeup of email will change, and we've seen here that phishing has actually dropped by 17% globally since last year. However, what we find here is that threat actors have changed their subject matter, moving away from more traditional COVID-related topics to now finance and mortgage-related phishing attacks. With threat actors moving toward automation, we're likely to see more agile changes in phishing subject matter, catering it dynamically to both regional and world events, making it even more tantalizing to click on. This goes to show that it is still very important to educate your staff around email, the threats of phishing, spear phishing, and whaling attacks. As well as that, it's also very important to have a robust email security solution in place to help mitigate as much phishing and spam as you can. So how do we put the threat report together? Well, we pull a lot of data from a lot of different sources. We have 1.1 million sensors globally, and these feed data to us anonymously, collecting data 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. This information, along with third-party specialists, as well as honeypots, allows us to pull all of this together, along with our zero-day threat data coming in at 140,000 pieces a day. This is what allows us to build our threat intelligence as an organisation. But also what this allows us to do is it allows us to look at trends within the marketplace over a quarter, 6 months, a year and further, allowing us to project where things will be going and allowing you to protect yourself as best as possible. After this dive into the 2023 threat report, I hope that you have a greater awareness of the threat landscape as it is, and that you can understand areas where you can tighten security for yourself and your organisation. For a more robust and deeper dive into the full threat report, please head over to sonicwall.com/threat report. Here you can download the full threat report, and I urge you to do so. It's really interesting reading and will really open your eyes as to what to expect going forwards. And now, time for the questions and answers. If you have any questions, please submit your question below under the Ask Question tab.